Staples. Mr. Staples, if you please come forward and give us your name for the record. We appreciate the assessor being here with us today. And you have 3 minutes to address the board, Mr. Staples.
Chairman Elias, Bill Staples, Pima County Assessor. I will be brief.
Good morning.
I'm thrilled this discussion is taking place. Now is the time for this board to decide whether or not taxes are raised, stay the same, or lowered. It has nothing, shouldn't say nothing, it has little to do with the value of the property, which was set, or the role was conveyed back in December of 2018. We're done with the 2020 role as far as our value is concerned. If this board decides to raise taxes, that's your decision. If this board leaves them the same, that's your decision. If this board lowers taxes, it's your decision. The thousands of phone calls my office gets when tax bills go out, we will happily forward them to you for you to take credit or explain your votes. And I mean, obviously there are plenty of people that would like taxes raised. I think there are plenty of people that like taxes would like taxes lowered. It's completely up to you at this public meeting. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Staples. Okay, that concludes our speakers. Any comments from members? Ms. Miller, you wanted to make some comments?
Yes. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Supervisor Elias.
That's pretty cool Woodstock blouse you have on today.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it looks like it, doesn't it? When I first presented, and it's been through a couple of iterations, proposed possible cuts to the budget. I had an idea that I would put up different options, and they were all presented as possibilities, and that we might come together and agree with some, reject others, and I think, you know, we had a pretty good discussion. And we might come up with some other possibilities that we would substitute, and collectively we'd all figure out how to adopt a budget that didn't raise taxes. I've been calling it a tax-neutral budget. Let's just say it's a budget that doesn't raise taxes. The process didn't work like I originally hoped that it would work. First, my efforts were introduced a few weeks ago as a show when I first brought it to this board. Trust me, I don't stay up late at night. I don't go through all this analysis because I want to put on a show, and I want to be, met with opposition. And that's exactly what happened. I was met with opposition, and the analysis appeared to be conducted simply to discredit any proposals that I put forth. And I would like to note that when Supervisor Elias requested bringing in the raises to September from January, that was done with no analysis, with no discussion, with, not being considered a show. And I happen to agree with Supervisor Elias on that, but it's just interesting how the process worked. One of the analyses conducted by Administrator Huckleberry after my first proposal states, and part of my first proposal was looking at possibility of can we cut in the flood control district, because their capital projects went up $8.4 million this year from last year. So were there any possibilities for cuts? The county administrator came back, and in his memo he stated that and the percentage that I recommended amounted to $1 million, slightly over. And Mr. Huckleberry came back, and in his memorandum he said reducing the flood control tax revenues by $1 million was easy, and I'm quoting. This is when I had recommended the approximately $1 million from that budget. So the terminology that I am advocating to defund the flood control district is not accurate. It was simply looking at ways that we could help our residents and that we could look at possibly keeping this a tax-neutral budget. In addition, in the media, it appears specific items have been put out there. Flood district again was highlighted that that my proposal is devastating the flood district. $1 million out of their total budget. And what was interesting, I presented recommendations, possibilities, and it's in the background material today for anyone who wishes to look at it online. There were, can we find any more money? Can we push out hiring these employees until next year? There were parts of the process that I think were really good. I really appreciated all the discussion we had on this board over this budget, and the previous years, the proposals that I presented were dismissed, and the board could have done that this year and simply adopted the budget without discussion or consideration of what I put forward. And that didn't happen this year, and I really appreciate the fact that we were able to have a discussion and that there was a lot of input and a lot of back and forth. And a lot of analysis that came back from Mr. Huckleberry and his staff related to my proposal. And everyone addressed various concerns, the members did, on some of the options that I had presented, and they came up with their own presentations on what they thought should be investigated. At the last meeting, I did clarify what I meant by the definition of a tax-neutral budget. It is exactly what the assessor said. Keep the taxes from increasing on our residents, overall bottom line. And I hope that is clear to folks now. I know there were some issues with the language. When you get into the finance arena, there's a lot of different terminology, and it does confuse people. So hopefully, I think we're all on the same page now, and I think we all understand exactly what I meant by a tax-neutral budget. And I'm not sure if, I'm hoping that everyone's clear on that now. I've seen a lot of spin in the news media. Miller's going to be the winner if this budget passes. Miller is in the driver's seat. As we all know, I'm not a dictator. Typically, I'm on the losing end of things because I am a lot of times the lone voice, and one person cannot pass this budget. It takes a board majority, period. And the 5 members of this board are the ones who are in the driver's seat. Specifically, it will be at least 3 members, okay? So Miller's not in the driver's seat. Miller is not in control. This board is in control. I wanted to clarify that because it to me was not helpful for the discussion and not helpful for what we're trying to accomplish here. And I'd like to ask one of my staff members to put up a chart, and I will show you who the winners are. That takes a minute to come up, so before I start, I'd like that to appear. Hopefully everyone can see that. I did this last night and it was late. The winners are identified right here. These are who the winners would be if we don't raise taxes on our residents this year. The businesses in Pima County. Less taxes means they can keep prices lower. They can sell more goods because people will be able to buy more, and they don't have to pass on the increased cost to consumers. Working class families. They're potential future homeowners. Some of them are homeowners already. Less taxes mean they'll be able to afford a mortgage payment or purchase a larger home in the future. Senior citizens on fixed income, and this is a real problem in our community. They're on fixed incomes. Many are widowed. Many are trying to deal with the fact that their spouse has passed on, and now they're trying to live off that spouse's Social Security, and it's been cut in half because the spouse was drawing the full amount while they were still alive. This is a real problem I'm hearing from a lot of seniors in this community. Less taxes for them means that they don't have to find another thing to sacrifice, and many have to go without food or medical care because one more penny of taxes hurts them. And I heard someone say early, it only costs me $7 a week. Well, there are many of us in here in this room and many of us in this community, and especially in my district, it's the most affluent district, District 1, that they need to start thinking about the people who are not affluent, which is a very large percentage of our population. You know, $7 a week or a month, whatever the amount was, that means a lot to a lot of people in this community, especially when we have 24% poverty rate in the city of Tucson. That's according to the U.S. Census Bureau. And we haven't recovered like the rest of the state of Arizona or the rest of the country. So I really take that very seriously, and those are the people that keep me awake at night. It isn't about me and I can afford it. Think about other people around you and look around this community and look at the poverty and try to empathize with those people, try to understand what they are going through. And then I have the children up there because of the fact that we have so much poverty in this community. And we have to try to keep this budget neutral. I hope that we can. Pima County is an economic entity. The property taxes affect businesses wanting to come into this community. The businesses pay more money, and if we continue increasing our property tax rates or not decreasing them and continue to increase property taxes in general, has a snowball effect. We all know it. We all understand how economic development works. If the people have less money in their pocket, they're not going to the restaurant, they're not going to the small business, they're not able to buy as much, which hurts the small business, and it snowballs, and it hurts the economy. So I think it would help if we think of things in these terms. And I want to go back and address everyone's concerns from the prior two board meetings. One of the proposals I put on the table was to potentially cut monies from the library district. Their rate is going up 2 cents this year, which along with the increased valuations is causing a bigger impact. And I had suggested that maybe we could look at not hiring the 12 employees that are supposed to be hired right away, or pushing that out to next year, or even looking at some capital projects that were in the library district that are scheduled for this year. Supervisor Bronson objected to this, and she expressed her concern about that, and that was why that was initially in my proposal, and I decided, you know, since it was a very strong concern, and I've heard from a lot of residents about the libraries over the years, that, okay, let's take that one off the table as long as we find a way to cut in another area. Supervisor Valadez, in the June 4th meeting, you asked for a cost-benefit analysis of a tax-neutral budget and whether it was worth pursuing. And in the following meeting, you again asked for the same analysis, including the effects of a tax-neutral budget. I haven't seen that analysis in any of the memos, but I'd like to answer that. The answer is, if we can figure out a way to achieve this, a tax-neutral budget, not to raise the taxes, while addressing everyone's concerns that express them in these meetings, then I believe it is worth pursuing. And the benefits go to those folks. Those are the winners, not any of us up here, not me in particular. The winners would be all of these folks that I'm talking about. And Supervisor Valadez, you expressed in the previous two meetings the need to maintain the COPS as a safety net for the expenditure limitation in the event there were timing issues that could potentially affect our infrastructure. And, you know, I don't really like operating using debt instruments, but your point that we would have to cut the pay-go program convinced me that that was not a good idea to pursue. So that one's off the table. And then you discussed, your next concern was how will the proposals of making the tax-neutral budget affect the pay-go program, which is capital projects out in the future. And you, as well as Supervisor Elias, also asked for a plan that identified all the projects, the dollars associated with each project, the timeframes of start, finish, et cetera. And Supervisor Elias discussed his support of that request from you and of the detailed plan, and he specifically stated we need to ensure we're protected against the tyranny of the majority by putting this list out there, putting it in the public square, having the discussion, and making
That's
sure.
not quite accurate in terms of what I said. But I just comment that, what I was talking about is procedures related to pay to go well into the future, not just this budget, not just this particular
Okay.
issue. But it was more broadly stated because traditionally, when you move into pay-to-go kind of operations, it's the low-income districts that take it on the chin, and so I just want to make sure that we don't. But
Okay,
thank you for mentioning that.
thank you for clarifying.
Sure.
And again, this was another analysis that Supervisor Valadez and Elias asked for, but I haven't seen it. I don't know if you've seen it, but I haven't seen anything on this, and I think it is a very important analysis that we should evaluate. I think that was a really good recommendation, and I would like to see it so we could all have a discussion about that list of projects and whether they add value or if they're projects that could potentially be moved out. I realize that at this point, the only option left is for that decrease, and we need to find out of the roughly $1.3+ billion budget about $10.7 million to cut to make sure we have a tax neutral budget. And I realize at this point, based on all of the discussion that we have had, that the primary operating budget is the place to find this. And lastly, Supervisor Valadez, you voiced a concern about not wanting to use money from the general fund reserve balance to make a tax neutral budget. And based on Mr. Huckleberry's analysis, there is a potential for about $2 million available. But I respect your concern, and I've also eliminated that as an option for the cuts. Supervisor Christie, you addressed some of the same concerns as Supervisor Valadez, the COPS, the pay-as-you-go, all of which I agreed not to pursue to adopt a tax-neutral budget. You also expressed a strong concern about the $26 million for pavement preservation and the $5 million transfer from the general fund. I fully agree. We don't want to reduce pavement preservation funding for any reason, and we should figure out ways to actually grow this dollar amount, and hopefully down the road we can have those discussions that I think maybe we can find that some more money. And you also wanted to know if my proposal had any effect on the sheriff's deputy raises. The answer is no. I never suggested that raises be impacted in any way for the sheriff's department or any other department. I agree with Supervisor Elias that pulling those up and that we need to ensure that they get the raises. And I have been a strong advocate for the sheriff department raises. And then your last concern on the pay-as-you-go plan is how would it be affected this year? And to make the budget tax neutral, we can't eliminate any of those pay-go projects from the 2020 budget, and I agree with that. So we'll take all of that off the table. So the flood control off the table, at least as far as I'm concerned, and in my proposal. And then, although it isn't my preference, if the board desires to raise taxes next year, taxes can be raised based on the maximum levy amount. So the tax rate we set this year shouldn't impact next year's decision to fund the pay-as-you-go program. And then finally, Supervisor Elias, you requested those same analyses that I identified earlier. And I recall you wanted that pay-as-you-go administrative policy. And your last concern was the discussions and analysis that I did were not pragmatic. And in other words, you felt they weren't practical. And I'll address what I'm going to approach here shortly. And I believe it is practical, and we can have a discussion. So how do we proceed to adapt a tax-neutral budget? with a lot of things off the table now. And the pragmatic answer, and I have some handouts actually for board members that I'd like to give you.
Supervisor, what's still left on the table?
The primary budget, which I'm just getting to.
Thank you. Just by point of information, if I might, I was looking at the primary expenditure, I think is in the budgeted expenditure is 616 million and change. Of that, the general fund amount that we, Pima County, actually collect in taxes from our residents is only about 350 million, not the 616. So that's the pot we're looking at, just
Yes.
clarification, okay.
Yes, yeah. So everyone has the handout of the personnel expenses, and hopefully folks can see up on the screen. The first one up on the left is fiscal year 2017, and I have run these reports on the object codes that are related to personnel, salaries, wages, and benefits. The adopted budget for 16-17 was 486 million. The actuals came in at 456 million. The variance when at the end of the year, when you look at the actuals we spent for the year, we had 29 million left at the end of that fiscal year. Fiscal year 18, which is 17-18, there was 39 million left. And fiscal year 19, which just ended on June 30th, 2019, 39 million left. And I ran this report. These are the final numbers. And the adopted budget for this year, based on the vacancy report, we are showing 1,058 full-time equivalents. And the amount budgeted for that, I ran the numbers, and it's $52 million that we have budgeted for vacancies. These are vacant positions that have not yet been filled. The actual, this data came from the vacancy reports that are under the finance department on the intranet. The number of vacant positions in the beginning of each of those 3 years was well over 1,000. And the number of vacant positions at the end of those 3 years was well over 1,000. We have budgeted for these positions, and the bulk of them remain unfilled at the end of each year. So I wanted to note on the lower right-hand, daily savings. The fiscal year ended June 30th. On July 1st, this 1,058 vacancies amounted to $201,675 for 1 day. If we look at a 30-day period, it's $6 million just for 30 days for not filling those positions.
Supervisor Miller, could I ask a question?
Sure.
On the
Supervisor Christie, you have the floor.
thank you. The actual vacancies you indicate from 2016, 2017 to 2019, 2020 have roughly been about the same, about 1,000?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
I pulled those numbers right off the database.
Just
and
as a question, if the vacancies have remained consistent over those years.
they've actually been over that, but I'm being conservative when I say 1,000.
I'm wondering why there is such a huge variance in the variance, why there's from 29 million in 16 to 52 million.
Because
What causes that?
well, the 52 million is the budgeted vacancies for this year. So this is what is budgeted for the 1,058 positions in this year's budget those positions are vacant right now. The 39, the 29, 39, and 39 million in the last 3 years, the variance between the adopted budget and the actuals, the reason there's that savings is because positions were not filled. That's where that money comes from. And, okay, so yesterday on July 1st, we saved $201,000. Last couple of days, after the end of today, we'll have saved over $400,000 because those positions aren't yet filled. So, as I said earlier, at the end of a month, it'll be $6 million just from those positions not being filled. So how do we take advantage of this while addressing everyone's concerns? I think we could insert a negative amount under the primary operating tax expenditure line. Why? Because these savings are going to happen naturally. Supervisor Elias, you addressed this specifically in the last board meeting when you said our fund balances increase naturally as a result of carrying these funded but vacant positions. So when we don't fill them, we're not spending the money. So that's why you're seeing that big variance at the end of each of the years. So I looked at this, and I'd like to point out that we really can't ignore this data. This is real data. This is right off the finance website. And I looked at it and I go, okay, so what's the worst thing that could happen if we put a negative entry in there for the 10.7 million? Taxpayer gets a break this year. And let's say we aren't able to sustain that negative entry. Let's say tomorrow or in the next few months we go out and hire an additional 1,058 employees. I don't think we're going to be doing that. That is proof that we're not going to be doing that. The last 3 years' data, which is all we have on the database on the website. So the worst that can happen is that we give them a break this year, but we have to raise taxes next year to hire those employees. There's no real loss to the taxpayer. The likely scenario, the most likely in my opinion, is the taxpayer will get a break this year. Next year we'll still have an equivalent number of vacant positions as we have in the last 3 years. And we have the option to decide at that time whether to give the taxpayers a reduction next year or not. There is no need to eliminate the vacant positions because there was a lot of pushback when I suggested that we eliminate some of those because, as Mr. Huckleberry called it, a budget maneuver or padding the budget is how we always described it. We simply evaluate next year. Can we do this again? And to me, that still sounds good. The best case scenario, the taxpayers get the break this year. And then maybe we could implement a program to incentivize employees to look for efficiencies. Try to find cuts for up to 2% of the budget. And that reduction, this is less than 1% of our overall budget, okay? And that reduction would cover the removal of the 10.7 million. And we could possibly give the employees a raise next year if they found that 2% in efficiencies. The taxpayer gets a break next year, gets a break this year, while the employees are rewarded with equivalent raises 2 years in a row. That's a best case scenario. Nobody loses and everybody wins. Those people in the circle, if we could put that back up, those are the people that would win. Does this create a budget hole? Because we keep hearing that term, it creates a budget hole. No, it does not. The negative expenditure that I'm suggesting that you put the negative entry in there, it's used to reduce the taxes on an equivalent ratio of 1-to-1. If we remove the negative expenditure, taxes go up in the same amount that they were reduced next year. If, however, it was used for, if you did that negative entry and then you use those funds to buy an asset or used it to fund a program, you do create a budget hole. because you have to go out and fund whatever asset or program that you've implemented as a result of using those monies for other things. So I'm not suggesting we use the monies for anything, but those monies are going to be there anyway, and that is very clear from the last 3 years. $39 million this fiscal year that just ended June 19th. We are simply recognizing the savings that occur naturally from not filling those vacancies. And we saw that it happens every year. There are no increased expenses, and therefore it doesn't create the budget hole. Is it fair? Based upon the discussion, I think it's the fairest possible way to do this. We keep the flood district intact. We keep the other issues that everyone brought up intact. And we could use this to contribute to a tax break for our constituents. Doesn't force any small departments to cut a position that they can't afford to cut. Departments that have a lot of vacant positions can still fill them as they are able, but the data from the finance department on the vacancies shows that the bulk of these will not be filled. And we also know we have an attrition rate of roughly 13% across the board for Pima County. I believe that's what Mr. Huckleberry had. So that means we're going to have another, 13% of 6,000 is over 700 positions that we have to fill there as through attrition, as people leave, retire, move on. And with this economy, pretty much full employment, 3.6%. We heard the management that came through during the budget hearing say, we're going to have a really hard time finding people this year. We're going to have a really hard time because of the full employment, because there's a lot of competition for the good folks out there, which is a good thing. We know that it's going to be difficult. So we're going to have a difficult time just filling those positions through that are naturally drop off through the attrition process. In addition, we have these vacant positions as well. I think this, at this point, is probably the fairest method to achieve a tax-neutral budget and have everyone win. I think it addresses everyone's concerns, and Supervisor Elias, you certainly discussed how the fund balances rise each year, which is presented in that last chart, as the ongoing unfilled vacancies are budgeted. The members of this board can't deny that. We can't ignore that. We've got to look at that and decide what we're going to do. This proposal addressed every one of your concerns. I believe I went through them all. And I think it's time for us all to take a stand and make a decision. Can we do this? Will we do this? I know we hear a lot about what Maricopa is doing, what the state is doing, and I will tell you I'm not pleased with the state taking our tax cuts. I'm not pleased with a lot of things. The $32 fee added on to our vehicle licenses, and not called a tax, but it's a tax. Those were real disappointing, and we have to think about the residents here with our 24% poverty rate having to deal with that as well, and then having to deal with us increasing the rates. I think we should be the leader. I don't think we should follow the others. I don't think we should point the finger at others and say, you know, they did this, so we have to do it as well, and we have to increase because they're passing this on to us. I hope that this small amount, less than 1%, that we can either agree to utilize this $10.7 million to do this entry, or we can agree to continue it, to study it more, and really make an effort on behalf of the taxpayers of this community. And I would really look forward to hearing from all of you on this potential. And I know Supervisor Valadez, I can see already you got a lot of questions. And I think it's really important and healthy for us to have this discussion. And I don't know why this isn't possible. So With that,
Thank you, Ms. Miller.
I
Appreciate your
will-
comments.
thank you.
Any other comments from board members?
I was-
Supervisor Bronson,
I was
please.
just going to ask our finance staff, and I don't think they have a copy of the submittal that you just gave us. But in terms of the variances with the full-time equivalents, do you have any comments, or Mr. Huckleberry?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and members of the
Mr.
board,
Huckleberry.
let me try and address some of these issues. And I think they've been raised in previous memorandums I've sent to the board. And I think if you look at that memorandum of June the 18th, the most recent one, I included a table that really talked about imposing attrition. And we picked a number of 2.5% attrition, and that 2.5% would generate about $9 million. So that's in the ballpark of the numbers that people are talking about. I think that the difficulty here is what I've said in previous memorandums that we sent to the board on June the 11th and again on June 14th, addressing the issues that this board has raised. And let me give you the best example is that the sheriff will end this year's budget about $4.5 million in the good. And I've indicated previously to the board, one of the reasons is that he has a number of unfilled positions. In fact, he has the most, about 150. And so that's always used to, for other reasons. He has used that money, that savings, in his basic salary plans that basically gave raises to the correction officers and to the sheriff's deputies. And so what he's done is he's eaten that $4.5 million up down to maybe, if we're projecting his next year's budget, to be about $500,000 over. So that's where that money has gone to. Then if you go to the table that I gave you, the 2.5% attrition, the sheriff is obviously the largest contributor because he has the largest payroll, and that's about $3.4 million. So what that means is the sheriff has gone from, in 1 year, a $4.5 million surplus to a $500,000 less, $2.9 million deficit. And that's what this does because of the number of unfilled positions are quite irregular in county departments and agencies of the county. And so in fact, I highlighted that on the last page of my June 11th memo, the number of positions. So I think, you can do this. The question is whether or not there will be, as there always is, a number of exceptions. No, we don't need to impose this on the sheriff. So if we don't impose a 2.5% across the board attrition on the sheriff, he comes back to this board next year wanting $2.9 million to make his budget actually balanced in the next fiscal year. So that's the danger of what you're talking about.
Mr. Chairman?
Very true.
I-
Supervisor Miller, please.
The sheriff's, if I recall correctly, he's got about a little over 10 million of vacancies budgeted. If I recall, I went through those numbers at some point. So there's still, a significant, we've got $39 million out there. And if we're looking at this, it's 10.7 million that we need to come up with. And we know those are at year-end numbers. That's at the end of the fiscal year that we have those funds, these underruns due to not filling these vacant positions. And if the sheriff doesn't fill his, and in any budget practice I've ever been in, if you're utilizing headcount numbers to subsidize your budget, I think that's not a very good practice, because then you get hit with something like this because somebody comes along looking at possibly making cuts. So, and I know you went through the exercise several years ago of taking out a whole lot more vacancies, but I'm just looking at this, and these are the actual numbers. And of that 52.4 million dollars this year, I believe about 10.5 million is the sheriff's portion of it. So if we're looking at, these kinds of underruns every year, I still say it's possible. I know there are situations, and the sheriff expressed that he can't lose those vacancies because he needs to hire more people, okay? But there are a lot of them out there that aren't getting filled every year. And with this tightened labor market, I go back to that again, 3.6% unemployment, which is pretty much full employment based on my economics classes. I think anything below 4% is considered full employment. That it's going to be extremely, even more difficult this year to hire. And I heard that from many of the presentations during the budget hearing. So I'm still not understanding, and I know that it's something that, we're going to have to monitor. But still, I don't understand why we can't accomplish this.
I've got one other question
Supervisor
of staff. The adopted for 1920 was about almost 519 million with a 1058 FTE. Of that 500 and say almost 19 million, how much of that is actual because this is personnel, not all our personnel are paid out of the general fund. Some are paid through grants. So do we have any delineation on that? That's a lump sum number. I guess what I'm asking, is that a general fund number, or are some of these positions actual grant positions that would have no effect on the tax rate?
This includes all of them. You are correct. And if you look at that 52.4 million, that includes all of them.
Okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and members of the board, best way to probably estimate that is if you look at our payroll in the general fund, it's about 360 million. So you really, and if that's the total for 520, so you just do the ratio, so it's about maybe 60% general fund.
That falls right into line with what we're seeing of the underruns.
But of that so the tax rate, or the not tax rate, the total tax amount that we're talking about, that 10 million, if it's grant funded, then if some of those positions are grant funded, then that has no effect on it can't be included in the 10 million. Okay.
Supervisor Miller, given all of these things, what would you foresee at this point what the next step could or should be?
Well, I was working on this last night. I would like to see a continuation. We don't have to pass this budget until August 5th. I'd like to have Mr. Huckleberry, the finance department, all of the supervisors have the ability, and we still have some analyses that Supervisor Valadez asked for that I think would be really important to look at. Supervisor Elias asked for some, along with this, and do an analysis and see if it's possible to do it.
Can we have submitted to all of us what you just basically used for your presentation?
I thought I gave you a handout.
With this, you did, but I
Yeah.
mean, your
My
actual-
notes are, it's
Yeah.
pretty hard to understand them, but,
Well,
because they're thrown together and.
But I think a general outline, an overview.
Okay, I think this is, pretty much summarizes it, but
Well, your statements about the pay-go and all of the concerns that
Okay.
everybody, I think are very important that they be memorialized in this. And if you would want to put what you just suggested about a continuation in the form of a motion, I would second it.
I don't think we're done with the discussion, are we? Okay. Anyone else? If there aren't any questions questions, Supervisor Miller. I noticed that under the fourth box there, under adopted 2019-20, you've got the adopted amount. The actual FTEs, but you estimated the savings at about 52.5 million. Where did you come up with the 52.5 million? And there's a reason why I'm asking this.
That came out of the data analytics database matched off with the PCN numbers. And I matched them off for the vacant PCNs and just added them up.
Because typically what I just did some calculator analysis, I think you saw me on the calculator here, is when I did the math based on just the end of year balance, just the historical, I tried to go with the highest number possible, and I ended up with 40.5 million, not 52 million. I understand where you got it, but I'm not sure there's a connection there in this. Let me ask the county administrator another question, however. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Huckleberry, my question is this. First of all, is the number of 1,058, the FTEs, actual vacancies, correct, to the best of your knowledge?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Valadez, I think we reported on that previously in another memorandum. And what we said is that if you look at the attrition rate, we probably got 800 vacancies going all the time, being re-advertised, selected, hired, that whole circular process. So, you know, you have a vacancy, and then you have probably 800 of them in process somewhere.
So,
If I may.
Please, Supervisor Valadez.
The follow-up question that I have to that is a simple one. Are the vacancies at the beginning of the fiscal year the same vacancies we have at the end of the fiscal year, or do we have attrition in the different positions over here than they were at the beginning of the fiscal year?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Valadez, they're almost all different, with the exception of those departments who were hoarding PCNs basically to pad their budget.
And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Huckleberry, could you give us a list of those departments again that are hoarding the PCNs?
They're the last page, I think page 11 of my earlier memorandum, and they're basically the sheriff, the juvenile court, and other electeds, including the assessor at 32, I believe. Yes, I got the sheriff is 150, juvenile court 101, the county attorney 79, superior court 70, health 62, assessor 34.
Okay. Because I think part of what needs to be understood here in this part of the discussion is that we can't. I mean, Supervisor Miller and Mr. Huckleberry were really kind of talking about the savings that we could realize on the right hand, while understanding that next year we would put them into a deficit situation. But in truth, it's still a point that I think deserves a lot of discussion, simply because we, as a budgetary body, which is the responsibility that no other elected in Pima County has, can't really have a true budget because these PCNs are being hoarded so that we don't know what the actual fiscal needs of those departments are. Because I think, Mr. Huckleberry, am I correct in the fact that this board has directed you and you have gone out and really kind of removed those excess PCN hoardings throughout the rest of the county other than these exceptions?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Valadez, essentially yes. And in the case of the sheriff, what he is doing is he's spending his hoarded PCNs to give raises this year.
Okay.
So there's the problem, that if you apply attrition rate, you know that next year he's going to be in a deficit position.
But, and I guess that's the trade-off, is he'll be in a deficit situation, but we'll actually know what the fiscal numbers are going to be, as opposed to allowing these different departments, which are listed here, which are the sheriff, juvenile court, county attorney, superior court, health, and assessors, the leeway to kind of really kind of fudge at that. We would actually know what their budget was on that 1 year. Is that correct?
Again, Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Valadez, if you want to apply the attrition to those agencies, then I think yeah, you're going to find out real quick where their real budget needs are. And I think that basically we've pretty much done that throughout the county. Some of these are, in fact, in the juvenile area, I know some of them are dealing with detention, and they're spending that money in their alternatives to detention. So again, those aren't real. Those are personnel savings that are being spent contractually with, let's say, other providers in providing detention alternatives. So they're really not real. And so there's the danger you have here. You've got different pieces, different things going back and forth. Again, my recommendation is what you've done and adopted the tentative. If you want to address this problem, I think that the way to do it is comprehensively during this next fiscal year, so that when we get to the following fiscal year, we can really decide, how much personnel savings we can actually embed in the budget as far as attrition, and to make sure everybody abides by it. That's the problem we've always had is, we used to budget attrition uniformly 10, 15, 20 years ago. Then it got to be attrition by department. Then it got to be varying by department. Some would do it, some wouldn't. So it was a budget mess.
Okay.
Supervisor Valdez?
Yes, sir.
Can I just add that the part of what Mr. Huckleberry was saying is hard to quantify. Speaking about juvenile court, when we create those alternatives to incarceration and we look at what's happened over the last 15 years and the decline of number of kids that we have in detention, I don't know how we can quantify the savings that we've made in that, because keeping kids out of jail into the future, there's no way to calculate that number or no kind of quotient that can help you understand it. But those are very real dollars too. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's a good indicator of how complicated all of this becomes once you start taking it apart into pieces. It's not a simple thing. Any trick that you use like this is going to come home to roost, and I think that's really the key.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not really advocating one position or another right now. What I'm trying to gather is this board has the sole budgetary authority in Pima County, but through this process, we've lost some of that authority. Because as you know, I would not have a problem
Right.
funding those same programs as juvenile,
I agree.
but they're not here for me to vote on.
I agree, and I think that's why Mr. Huckleberry frankly makes sense, and that we got to take some time to figure this all out and sort it all out. It can't be done in the course of budget hearings or a study session or any of that. It's a difficult answer. So I understand what you're doing, and I just wanted to add that for the public's sake, kind of, because I know that you understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So part of the discussion, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Huckleberry, I want really kind of lay out a little bit of understanding when we're talking about how much of the budget this board actually does have jurisdiction over. We're talking about a $1.3 billion budget. How much of that do we really have discretion over, roughly? And it can be ballpark.
Well, Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Valdez, it's depending upon what you, and the interpretation of what's mandated and non-mandated. And, you'll listen to the sheriff and the courts and the rest, and they're all mandated. You have very little discretion over much of the budget that's not mandated. Maybe your Parks and Recreation, Natural Resources Department, that's not mandated. Most everything else is pretty much mandated. So when you talk about discretionary services, there are very few,
Okay.
if any.
And basically, what I really wanted to, and I think you've quantified it before, when we talk about what part of the budget we can subtract and add from, what is that, 25%?
If that, and so, what you're, I think the point that we need to come back to the fundamentals of this budget,
Right.
and it was really the transitional budget from capital debt financing to pay-as-you-go. And you can't get there by holding your primary property tax rate below any neutral levy. I mean, you cannot build the money that you're going to need to pay for pay-as-you-go. If you look at the table that I've included in my earlier memorandum, I said most of our pay-as-you-go is going to pavement repair. 5 million this year in the general fund. So if you don't want to raise, if you want to drop the primary 7 cents, well then, you know, the first place I would go to is the discretionary $5 million that goes to pavement repair. So that's, you know, so we delay pay-as-you-go a year. Well, that's fine. Maybe it's better to delay pay-as-you-go a year, take that 5 million out of pavement repair and reduce the primary by that amount of money. That's the options I think you have. I think working on these other options, you know, particularly attrition, you could probably attrition and probably get away with it and make everybody comply with it, mandatory at a low percentage, maybe 1%. But when you start applying 2.5% to the sheriff and it's $3.3 million, you're going to hear from them pretty immediately. And so I think that's what we have to remember. Then I think, you know, you go back, everyone says, well, don't compare us with Maricopa or don't compare us to any other county. You go back and look at Maricopa and they haven't had any trouble at all holding their tax rates constant over the last 4 years and calling it a conservative budget. And that's, you know, basically 4 Republicans running Maricopa County. If you looked at the material that just came out just recently from the Arizona Tax Research Association, you look at all of the counties, all of 15 counties, you'll see that our increase in the primary is the 3rd lowest of 15 counties. What that means is 12 other counties are raising their primaries more than ours. So I don't think we've got anything to apologize for by trying to basically shift to a pay-as-you-go capital program and stay out of debt financing.
And you actually beat me to my next set of questions, actually. I wanted to go into the pay-go and some of the implications of what we're talking about. I mean, obviously, as a policy question, thus far, this board has been headed in the direction of taking the reduction in the secondary for the debt service, so half, and using that to start building up the pay-as-you-go. Now, part of my concern in this is that if we start looking at trying to find those 10.7 million dollars and strictly out of primary, because we obviously did an analysis and it's actually here of different flood control issues, but that's off the table at this point. The effect, from what I can tell, is likely going to be that at some point in time we're going to have to either or both elongate how long it's going to take us to get into a pay-as-you-go, which could put people at risk essentially. Or we're going to have what I'm going to refer to as a spike year, where we are going to have at least one spike year, where, I mean, typically the board over my tenure here has really tried to, even when we increase property taxes, we try to be small and predictable as opposed to spikes, because that's not something anyone likes. Not our businesses, not our residents, not our homeowners. So we try and avoid those spikes, but if we try and achieve, and I've been struggling with this all weekend myself, if we try to achieve that tax neutral, or property tax neutral, which is what I'm calling this term because the tax neutrality under state statute is actually something I dare not try to explain. But if we try and achieve a tax neutral, how do we either, in my mind, we can't do that without elongating the pay-go implementation period, or have at least one, if not multiple, spike years. Is that correct analysis?
Mr. Chairman, essentially yes, because see, what you're doing is that you don't get the first reduction in the secondary until next year, and that's the debt service reduction of 18 cents. So again, the theory of the policy of this pay-as-you-go program is to basically take half of the reducing tax rates in the secondary, transfer them to the primary, and at the same time, we know as long as the primary tax base continues to expand, that you're going to have an increasing amount of revenue given the same tax rate. What we said is we should continue to reduce that by half. So you're really looking at trying to build the pay-as-you-go half out of the reduction in debt service and half out of the growth in the tax base, until you reach an equivalent level of $50 million per year in the primary for pay-as-you-go capital. So that, and I estimated that'll take about 5 years to get to.
Okay.
But again, that's articulated in the budget memo. It's not articulated in actual board policy at this point because, again, it's a proposal of this budget, and it requires the board to act on it.
And so essentially, and I'm going to try and illustrate it in a very simple way, is that we've got one rate going down, and we're using half of that reduction to basically implement the PAYGO. So there's an offsetting.
There's an offset, and you're going to see a total tax reduction, and you're going to see a continuing reduction in the primary. But you're not going to see a reduction in the primary as much as it could be with giving back all of the tax-based growth.
And therein lies some of my concern. Obviously, we're not really talking right now about reducing the flood control because obviously there's issues at stake there. But in terms of implementation of that PAYGO, could you share with us, obviously right now we've asked for a PAYGO plan similar to our economic development plan so that we can, as a board, have it very clearly, as well as the board policy and administrative policies that we're going to use to put that together going forward. But right now, can you illustrate for us if what projects would be delayed, to the best of your knowledge, if we delayed implementation of the PAYGO plan?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Valadez, again, if you looked at the table that I've developed with regard to pay-as-you-go and pavement repair, it's $5 million transfer from the general fund to pavement repair. That's obviously, that's the way I built the pay-as-you-go starting plan. So if you don't do pay-as-you-go, that goes away.
All right, so let me ask you another question. We heard a little bit about this earlier and mentioned. Obviously, typically, this board has dealt with a budget where we are the state's bagman or bag person to collect taxes so that they don't have to. As the state's bagman, how much of an increase have we seen this year in cost shifts?
Mr. Chairman, at the very end of the session, we were hit with an additional $3 million in our all-tax payments, and that's on top of the additional $7 million that we pay in additional state retirement for our employees. So there's $10 million that we've already had to absorb in this budget process.
So that's $10 million out of a 10.7 as the state's bagman.
That's correct.
All right. All right. At this point, I think part of the issue that we've discussed is we're going to we've really kind of talked about the FTEs, going back to that FTE issue. In terms of last time we had talked about it being an actual freeze, and that would actually be more productive if the same positions at the beginning of the fiscal year were the same empty positions at the end of the fiscal year, but they're not. So that could actually have some very bad effects if we actually try to implement that freeze, because it could potentially end up with a lot more than the 7 to 1,000 positions being left open at the end of the fiscal year. But the only way, obviously, that part of the reason we're having that discussion is if you freeze a position, it allows you to take the money that you realize at the end of the year and use it in your calculation at the beginning of the year, and thus reducing here, which is why we were talking about that, and Supervisor Miller talked about 3, 6, 9, or full year of that freeze. It becomes a lot more complicated when you're talking about the different positions being open at the beginning of the fiscal year than at the end of the fiscal year. So, all right. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield at this point in case there are more questions and discussion.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you very much. You know what? We're going to take a break, so we'll be
Oh,
back
okay.
in a few
I
minutes.
wanted to address some of the comments.
You can
Okay.
afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a break. We'll be back at the sound of the gavel. I'd like to call back to order the Board of Supervisors meeting for July 2nd, 2019. Supervisor Valadez, you still had the floor.
No, Mr. Chairman, I had yielded.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Miller?
Now I've lost my notes. Give me a minute, please.
Anybody else want to
Go
make
ahead,
comments
wait.
while Supervisor Miller's looking for her notes?
The first thing I want to address is that this is not the attrition that will occur throughout the year will be separate and distinct from these that we're starting the year with. I'm not saying that some of those were from last year where people had retired or whatever, but the attrition that will occur throughout the year is a separate issue. And that's roughly 13%, which is 700 and some odd positions. The pay-as-you-go. And I think what I understood Mr. Huckleberry to say is that it could impact that because people have budgeted PCNs to pay for other things, and use the sheriff as an example. The pay-go, right now we're looking at 50%, and in your memorandum you talked about Maricopa County, who actually took the whole 100% to put into their capital program. And this is from my proposal last time in the background material on the agenda. Are we able to, if we so desire, to accelerate that pay-go and put a higher percentage to the pay-go program? And I had a proposal of 75%, 100%, and I said anywhere in between, that if we decided next year, we could do that. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, yes, you could. Again, it's the 18 cents.
Right.
We just made an arbitrary decision to split it, half back to the taxpayer, half to the pay-as-you-go program. Same thing with growth, half to the taxpayer, half to the pay-as-you-go program. But you could vary that in any manner you want to, and that's up to this board.
So if we ran into a problem with this 10.7 million, and I'd like to point out again that chart that shows the last fiscal year and this fiscal year that just ended June 30th, we've got 39 million underrun on personnel expenses due to these vacancies not being filled. So that's real money from the budget. That's real money. And if we did the 10.7 million, that's let's do the 39 million assume this year, and your Mr. Huckleberry discussed the Sheriff's Department. Are they the exception? Who knows? The one thing I think if we do this, that the first thing, it's going to drive good budgeting behavior. People aren't going to be padding their budget with vacancies anymore if we do this. I think we're going to get more realistic numbers and a more realistic budget to look at, because as Supervisor Valadez said, we're not quite sure where we stand. And that's a pretty bad position to be in right now, is to not be able to understand, gee, can we do this or not? Because we don't know what people have done in terms of padding their budget. Is it real padding? Is it being used for other expenses? I don't like it. I don't like that we're in this position, but I want to point out again, $39 million at the end of this fiscal year on June 30th. That is the underrun. That is the amount of money we're talking about, and it is a pattern. You can see it the last 3 years. I don't have the numbers for prior years prior to that, because, and I know we cut a huge amount of vacancies out, so it was probably far higher. I think it was 2015 that Mr. Huckleberry made a real strong effort to cut vacancies, and it was a huge number. So it was probably far higher in some of those prior years. And if this created a problem, and I don't think it's going to, because we've got a pattern of 39 million, we could look at possibly accelerating the pay-go if we had to, if it somehow impacted that. I don't think it will, But if it somehow impacted that, we could look at potentially accelerating and going with a higher percentage instead of the 50%. In the 75% scenario, 50% creates about 93 million, 93.4 million. 75% is 140 million. That's an additional funding of 46.7 million. And then if you went to the 100%, it would be 186 million. I don't think we'd want to do that, but I think we could look at, okay, if this became a problem, could we go back and look at that? I would like to see that analyzed. I would like to have a discussion about that. I don't know if any of the other board members think that's worth looking into, but I certainly do. The tax base, if I recall, we're projecting a pretty flat growth in the tax base. And I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I think maybe a little bit of a spike this year, if I recall, and it wasn't that much, 3%. Was it 3%, Mr. Huckleberry? I don't.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, is 4.85% this year, and it's projected to be about the same next year.
Next year, 4.8,
Yes.
and then it goes flat after that, because I know
It drops to about 3% and
Okay.
stays at 3% for the next several years, depending on whether there's a national recession or not.
Okay, okay. So the pay-go, if we took 10.7 million out of that 39 million, I really find it hard to believe that we're going to be in a situation where we're going to be in trouble in terms of having to go find other funding. I heard you about the Supervisor Valadez. You said, I think it was about another 2.7 million additional state cost shifts. And the 7 million is for our share of the pension liability. And that was one question I had. Do we have a profile of what that looks like? Is this additional amount that we paid this year, the 7 million, it is our share, do we have some sort of a profile that we can look at to see, is this going to happen every year? Is the increase going to keep going up? Is it going to stay now flatten out so that we're kind of stable? And I haven't seen anything on that. I think maybe ATRA might have that information. I'd like to get that because we don't know what's coming next year. And the actuaries that calculate this, you know, I read several years ago about the pension issues. It's been around as long as I've been here that this was coming. And I even recall speaking about this in a budget hearing a couple years ago. Hey, there's a red flag going up. We have pension issues coming. And I didn't hear anything further on it until this year. We have a increased pension liability. And I know that, I don't know what the actuaries, what the rules are, maybe Supervisor Valadez does in terms of what they're required to disclose at what point. Are they required to give us an idea of what this looks like in the future?
To that point, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Miller, what happened was that the legislature saw that, remember, we have 4 retirement systems, the
Right.
corrections, public service, elected officials, and the ASRS, which is the largest one. What ended up happening is that they saw that the trend from defined benefit plan was not sustainable, so that they made some changes that was later ruled about 2 years ago, that by the Arizona Supreme Court that was unconstitutional. So then what they did is they then went back and changed it so that it was only prospective, but they left all the governmental entities that invest in those 4 retirement systems on the hook for that amount. I believe they only gave relief to smaller entities. Yeah, but they left us on the hook for but it wasn't something we did. It was not something we could plan for. It wasn't anything that we had anything to do with, other than paying the bill.
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Valadez, was that was the lawsuit that was settled, and I understand this is, you know, we thought maybe we would win that lawsuit. But that was where they went back and tried to change the benefits on it for existing employees. I think we've learned our lesson that we never do that. Change those benefits, because there was another lawsuit, I believe, with the Sheriff's Department that we ended up absorbing. I think it was $6 million because of something similar. It is unfortunate that, you know, it was allowed to go on for so long before there was pension reform. And I have heard some rumblings that there were some pension issues this year that maybe reverse some of that reform. I'm not sure. I've got to look into that. I don't know if anybody else has heard about that. So, yeah, we do have that pension liability increase, and I don't think it's anybody's fault. I just wondered if we could get a profile, or if that information is available, and maybe since you were at the state legislature, I thought maybe you might know where we would get that. I assume we can get that from
The retirement, Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Miller, the retirement board's actually a separate entity from the legislature, and they're the ones that deal with these issues.
And on that note, has anyone requested that information so that we have that going down the road, or have they provided that to us? Are they required to provide that to us?
Mr. Chairman and members of the board, they calculate that every year and they provide it to the counties, and I think the one thing you can be assured of, it's not going down.
Yeah,
Got
yeah,
that right.
and I guess the thing of it is, you know, we just have to be planning, and I suspect it's probably even gonna go up. That's my concern, is that we'll be right back here next year having the same discussion. And I know it's real, and it's definitely something that we didn't plan on, but, you know, 10 million, there's 29 million up there, that we can look at doing this. And I think that would force better budget practicing, and I think, again, you know, I hate the fact, and I know you do too, Supervisor Valadez, that we're sitting here, and as you said, we don't really know. We don't really have a good handle on that because of this vacancy hoarding. So I'd like to see that we do it, and if we had to go back and do something by like accelerating the pay-go percentage, it's recoverable. And in the short term, in the 1 year, and then possibly, you know, if we find out there's huge issues with, you know, taking this out, but I don't think we're going to based on those numbers, we could look at that then. And I think it drives better budgeting behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Valadez, or you want to talk? Sure.
No.
Okay.
Are there any
Supervisor
more-
Valadez, go ahead,
Is
please.
there any more discussion?
Not for me.
Okay. If that, one other thing, and I'm going to address part of the issue in the motion once we get to the final budget, but I'm going to try and go ahead and move this forward. And let me start with item number 7, which is the final budget hearings, truth and taxation hearings. I'm going to move that we close the public hearing.
Second.
Motion and a second to close the public hearing. Discussion. Roll call.
Supervisor
Aye.
Supervisor Bronson,
Aye.
Supervisor Christie,
Yes.
Supervisor Miller,
Yes.
Supervisor Valadez,
Aye.
Chairman Elias.
Aye. Motion carries 5-0.
All right, now we're going to move
Board of Supervisors sitting as other boards.
under Flood Control District Board. Okay, I believe we have to treat both items separately, so let me move to item number 8 and close that public hearing.
Second.
Motion and a second. Discussion. This is that truth and taxation hearing
Correct.
for
Yeah,
flood
right.
control, just for everybody's edification, okay? Roll call.
Supervisor Bronson,
Aye.
Supervisor Christie,
Yes.
Supervisor Miller,
Yes.
Supervisor Valadez,
Aye.
Chairman Elias.
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. Supervisor Valadez.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of item number 8 and resolution number 2019 FC3 for the total amount of $16,914,213 and an effective rate of 0.3335.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve item number 9 Flood Control District final budget, including Resolution 2019 FC3. Roll call, please.
Supervisor Bronson?
Aye.
Supervisor Christie?
Yes.
Supervisor Miller?
Yes.
Supervisor Valdez?
Aye.
Chairman Elias?
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. We're on to the Library District Board.
Again, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I move that we do item number 10, close the public hearing. And this is the truth and taxation hearing again.
Second.
Yes. There's a motion and a second to close the public hearing. Discussion. Roll call. We better do roll call.
Supervisor Bronson?
Aye.
Supervisor Christie?
Yes.
Supervisor Miller?
Yes.
Supervisor Valdez?
Aye.
Chairman Elias?
Aye. Motion carries unanimously.
Mr.
We're
Chairman.
on to the Library District Budget, item 11, including Resolution 2019-LD1.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve item number 11, which is the Library District Final Budget and Resolution number 2019-LD1, and that is for $43,111,317 and an effective rate of 0.5353.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve the Library District Final Budget, including Resolution 2019-LD1. Discussion. Roll call, please.
Supervisor Bronson?
Aye.
Supervisor Christie?
Yes.
Supervisor Miller?
Yes.
Supervisor Valdez?
Aye.
Chairman Elias?
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. We're on to item 12, Stadium District Board. This is the Stadium District Final Budget, including Resolution 2019-SD1.
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Valdez.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve item number 12, resolution number 2019-SD1 for an effective budget expenditure of $9,071,755.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve the Stadium District Final Budget for 2019-2020, including Resolution 2019-SD1. Discussion. Roll call, please.
Supervisor Bronson?
Aye.
Supervisor Christie?
Yes.
Supervisor Miller?
Yes.
Supervisor Valdez?
Aye.
Chairman Elias?
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. We're on to the board sitting as the Board of Supervisors again. Item 13, unfinished business. This is the final budget for fiscal year 2019-2020, including Resolution 2019-48.
All right, I'm going to make a motion.
Supervisor Valdez.
I'm going to move that we approve item number 13, resolution number 2019-48 in an effective amount of, which am I using? Six,
Total.
what's that?
Total.
$1,817,540 and an effective rate of 5.5583. And furthermore, to address the issue, we are further directing and make it clear in the budget, the county administrator to come back with an approach to deal with the hoarding of PCNs, because it is to be made very clear through this motion that budgeting is the exclusive authority and responsibility of this board solely, and therefore we're directing the administrator to come up with a way of a comprehensive analysis of that hoarding, so that when we are here, we're not guessing where those monies are going. We can either choose to fund them or not.
Second.
Mr. Chairman, I'd
Supervisor Bronson, please.
You made a second?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to, if you would entertain a friendly amendment, also direct the county administrator to institute a 1% reduction across the board for all departments.
I'll accept that.
Okay.
I'm not sure I understand you.
On vacancies.
A 1% reduction in the total in the budgets of all departments in Pima County
Right now for this year.
right now for this year.
And how much does that come out to?
A 1% reduction of probably the 350 million, so you're talking about 3.5.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Supervisor Christie?
voting on this resolution, how does this affect what Supervisor Miller has been proposing?
Well, there's a motion and a second on the floor, and now we can open it up for discussion, so if that's okay. It will not, I guess my response is it won't affect it this year, but I also think I want to applaud her. I think what she's done is admirable, and I would like to explore that for next year's budget. I'm just not willing in this year, without some more analysis, to move forward in that direction. I think there are some questions that are not answered, but I think it's a reasonable approach to budgeting, and I want to applaud her for her time and effort that she put into this and her thoughtful consideration.
Would a friendly amendment be in order?
You can always try.
That the analysis that was requested by Supervisor Miller earlier regarding some of the reports and analysis that we've requested in past meetings that we have not yet received, as well as an analysis of the daily savings and the expenditures
Yes.
provided by Supervisor Miller be analyzed, and that we have a special meeting with that analysis for discussion prior to the August 6th deadline.
If we adopt the budget today, there's nothing, I mean, we can have a special session to discuss it, but there's no rush to do it by August 6th.
All right. So this discussion that we've had with Supervisor Miller's suggestions will be will effectively be dismissed.
That's correct.
At this point, but that will be in consideration for adoption of next year's budget. I'm just not willing at this point, without further analysis, to, and I have some problems with the 10 million in terms of how the tax TNT calculates that, because it doesn't include inflation, doesn't include population growth. So there's some issues that are worth discussing. But this is an admirable proposal. I'm just not, without additional information, and I don't think we can get that in the time period we have for budget adoption. I'm not willing to move forward with it, but I certainly want to put that on the table for next year's budget.
Well, then I'll withdraw my friendly amendment and just suggest that we still have, in the discussion process here, that we still have another meeting prior to August 5th to receive analysis of the proposals that Supervisor Miller has asserted and use them all together in conjunction of the motion on the floor right now. That's.
I don't think
I
that's
don't
in order.
I don't understand what you're doing, Steve.
I
Please
don't-
explain.
I'd like to. I don't feel comfortable voting on a final budget adoption for this year unless I received all the analysis that we've requested and that there is an in-depth analysis of
I see.
Supervisor Miller's recommendations as she's proposed them.
I still don't understand your motion. I understand your intent, but
Well-
I don't understand your motion.
He's withdrawn
I'm
it.
withdrawing my motion. I'm just talking.
What
discussion.
I think, and if I may, Supervisor Christie, I think what Supervisor Christie would actually like to do is continue this
Budget
section.
discussion, right.
And then have a meeting to come back and vote on this sometime before August 6th. I think that's what he intended.
That's exactly what I intended. And I do feel that there is adequate time to get the analysis and to get the information. And I don't feel comfortable voting on a budget for this year without exploring all of the options that have been discussed today at this board meeting. So if we already have a motion on the floor, so I can't make another motion.
You
right?
can
You can
make a
make a
substitute
substitute
motion, sir.
motion.
All right, I'll make a substitute motion, once again, that we have we continue this item to a date preferably, I would say on August 5th, because we have the August 6th deadline anyway, where we can analyze all of the criteria that have been discussed by the supervisors, particularly the information that we have not yet received that was requested prior to today's meeting, and on top of that, an in-depth analysis of the proposals submitted by Supervisor Miller in her presentation today.
I'll second that.
I have a motion and a second.
I think just point of order.
Go ahead,
We've
please.
already closed the hearing,
Right?
so the hearing would have to be reopened. We'd have to continue. I think the motion should be but we've already closed the hearing. So, yeah, I don't think we can do anything, but maybe we can.
Counsel, please.
Yeah, counsel.
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Bronson, I think that the board could reconsider the decision.
Oh, we can reconsider.
We
'cause
can
voted.
reconsider.
I do think if the final budget hearing is going to be continued, the truth and taxation hearing should be reopened and continued to the same
Right.
date.
So that would be my motion to accommodate that.
And Mr. Chairman?
No,
Yes.
you'd have to do a reconsideration of
First you have
closing
to,
the hearing.
well, first you have to move a reconsideration.
No.
Yeah.
Actually,
Go
the
ahead.
order, Mr. Chairman, if let me address the point of order, and
That's
then I have
fine.
a comment
Sure,
to
please.
Ms. Lusher. The point of order is we can actually consider this motion. If it passes, then we move into the reconsideration
That's right.
phase.
That's probably a better way to do it. Thank
So
you.
that way, we're not reconsidering without having a positive vote.
No.
Yeah, yes.
So, now going back to my original point, outside of the point of order, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Lusher, can we go ahead and ask staff to get some of the reports that were being discussed here, regardless of whether or not this motion passes or fails, to make sure that we get it in the,
Yeah, we have to get
Yeah.
them anyways. That's clear.
so, just to make that clear.
Yeah. clear.
That's in, by, you're just directing staff.
Right,
Okay.
just directing staff.
And that
That's fine.
direction would include the points that Supervisor Miller was
Yes,
providing today.
yes.
Not just those, but many more.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
Okay, so,
Wait,
Mr. Chairman, you, Chairman Elias and also Supervisor Valadez had requested analysis of the capital projects.
Right.
The pay-go, the listing.
Right.
And a procedure, and we have not seen that.
we don't need that before we
Which-
vote on this budget, as
But-
far as I'm concerned.
Well, I know you
I'm
don't, but
fine without
I
it.
would like to see it, and I don't know how anybody can make a decision when they don't
No,
have
it's
complete
not about that for
information.
me.
I think it's
not
really
about that for
important.
me.
Well, I know it's not for
We need to save
you,
that money and put it aside if we're switching to pay to go.
but there are
That's the
other
reality
people.
of it.
but-
How we go about doing that then is another set of decisions that we can make,
Excuse
Supervisor
me,
Miller.
Supervisor Elias, other people on this board are interested in seeing that information and
I get
having
it.
that analysis. And I understand you don't need it, but I know Supervisor Christie wants to see it, I want to see it, and I believe Supervisor Valadez would like to see it.
Well, let's
And
vote on it.
I don't know how anyone could vote on a budget without having complete information.
That's not it. I don't think, no, not at all.
And if I may address that point.
Sorry.
The issue isn't really whether or not I need to see the nuts and bolts. What we're dealing with right now, and part of
Exactly.
the discussions, I mean, I can appreciate the nuts and bolts and want to see them eventually, but
Right.
really what we're looking at is, as a fiscal strategy, what is a
That's
decision that is going to change our planned route right now going to do? Remember, we talked about either an extension and/or of the pay-go implementation period and/or a spike 1 or 2 years, and the spike 1 or 2 years is particularly worrisome to me. So it's a fiscal policy discussion, but we also have the undercurrent, which is what we're talking about as well.
Okay, we're ready to vote on Supervisor Christie's motion? Roll call.
Supervisor Bronson?
No.
Supervisor Christie?
Yes?
Supervisor Miller?
Yes,
Supervisor Valadez?
No.
Chairman Elias?
No. Motion fails 3-2. Back to the original motion. Call question
Could we repeat the original motion, please?
to approval of the budget, including resolution 2019-48.
And Mr. Chairman, If I could, the staff has brought to my attention that there's an error in, I believe we need to rephrase the motion that was
Okay.
talking about the levy amount and not the budget amount. Mr. Burke, did you want to clarify that?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Bronson.
Could you speak up? I can't hear. I don't know what's going on with the sound system,
Ma-
Taylor, but
Ms-
I haven't been able to hear all day. Could you please help us?
Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
exactly.
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Bronson, in your amendment to the motion, you mentioned the 1% reduction and referenced the amount of the levy, but not the amount of the budget. So we're to clarify, the 1% of 300 and some million is 3 million. 1% of the budget would be 13 million.
So it's 13 million that
So,
you're talking
so were you referring to a reduction of the levy amount?
We could do the levy amount, but I think some of that is our federal funds.
Right.
So what does that mean? Tell me what that means. And the state funds, I mean, I'd be happy to make it 1% on the entire 1.3 billion, but is there a legal impediment to doing that? No?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Brunson, I'm not sure that there's any legal impediment. Obviously, I think some sources of that entire budget are not going to be,
Right.
you won't be able to work with it because they're non-discretionary, they're mandated or whatever. I don't know that there's a legal impediment to imposing that restriction. I guess it does seem to change the number.
Well, then,
You could move to reduce all the non-restrictive dollars that we have spent.
well, we could,
About
or
1%.
we can use the 1.3 based on what is not restricted.
Right, that's what
Okay.
I'm saying. Is that clear to everybody on the board? Everybody gets it? So what does that make that figure then, Tom?
Well, we just need to say the it doesn't matter. We
I'm
don't
just
know.
asking him if he has that information.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I don't know exactly what's
Okay.
the non-mandated. There was one other clarification, though, that I would like to ask for Supervisor Valadez's motion. When he referenced the tax rate, the last number he mentioned was a 3, and in the memorandum, it's a 4. So it's, you have the number in front of you.
No, it's 5.5584, is that what you're saying?
Correct, 5.5584, and in your motion, you mentioned 8.3.
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Valadez, it's the tax rate under the town. He can't budget the first item, which is 5.5584.
Which is just what I said.
Right. Yeah.
That's all. That's just a clarification.
Okay, clarification.
You fine with that? Everybody understands what we're voting on? You understand?
Mr. Chairman, are we reducing the total budget by the 13 million that Supervisor?
No, what we're doing is we're reducing the unrestricted dollars in the budget by 1%. So that would exclude federal grants that are particular to specific spending that force us to do that, right? Or am I
No,
wrong?
we're not reducing the budget, number
Okay.
one. We're asking that departments take a 1% cut, but then
Oh, okay.
at the end of the fiscal year, that 1% cut will be reflected in the variance.
Right.
So it will be a fund balance.
I see exactly. Now, that is, I just misstated it. I understood that to be the question. Supervisor Miller, do you understand it now?
I do understand it. It's just going to further increase those numbers, so we're going to have more funds at the end of the year,
That's correct.
which is.
Which we then can use for PAYGO.
Right?
Yeah,
Or we could look at doing more pavement improvements.
Well, that's part of PAYGO.
yes.
Well, I'm speaking that very specifically, just so that everybody knows.
Thank you.
All right, roll call.
Supervisor Bronson?
Aye.
Supervisor Christie?
No?
Supervisor Miller?
No.
Supervisor Valadez?
Aye.
Chairman Elias?
Aye, motion carries 3-2. Okay, and